Good evening, everybody, and welcome to History Author Talks. Happy Patriots Day. If you are in Massachusetts, it's actually a holiday. If you are not in Massachusetts, I wish you happy Patriots Day anyway. As most of you know, 276 years ago, today was the Battle of Lexington and Concord. And tonight, we are really lucky to have who I think is probably one of the biggest experts on this topic. He is certainly somebody who I have been following now for years. But before we get to his introduction, I just want to give you a few comments about some of the things that I'm up to here at 10crucialdays.org. We have tours that are coming up, one in August and three in December and one in January. So you can go to 10crucialdays.org and you can find out about all of the tours that we are giving in the 10 Crucial Days historic area. We also have at 10crucialdays.org a lot of resources about the American Revolution, so you can certainly find out more there, including book lists. Also, just as a reminder, at historyauthortalks.com, you will be able to click on the past programs tab and see any of our programs from our past shows, just as you will be able to see this program as it is being recorded. So I welcome you all, many of my regulars and lots of new folks. Special welcome to my compatriots of the SAR and the DAR and the other heredity organizations who have joined us this evening. You know, I always love to have you with us. So with that, I would like, and just one last thing. As we go through the show, remember that my regulars know, remember that if you want to have a question for our author, you use the chat feature, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You just use the chat feature and send the question. That question comes to me. I will fit those questions into our program this evening, time permitting. So with that, I am very pleased that we have with us this evening, John Bell. John is the author of The Road to Concord, How Four Stolen Cannons Ignited the Revolutionary War. John grew up in Massachusetts, enjoying the state's celebration of Patriots Day every April, though not the reenactment of the skirmish, because it takes place at dawn, and well, he's just not a morning person. I also, John is an honorary fellow of the Massachusetts Historical Society, an elected member of the American Antiquarian Society and the Colonial Society of America, a trustee of the Dublin Seminar for New England Folklife, and a past board member of the International Wizard of Oz Club. So as you can see, he's a real Renaissance man. In addition to his book, The Road to Concord, John's other writing about the revolutionary America includes the daily updates on his website, Boston 1775, a book-length study of the National Park Service of George Washington's Cambridge headquarters, articles for everything from scholarly journals to children's magazines, and the scripts for historic comics. Now, if you have not subscribed to Boston 1775, I wholeheartedly endorse his blog. It is well-researched, it is fascinating, it is the best serial you could possibly come up with. And as we are coming up to America's semi-quincentennial, I urge you to read such wonderful stories and John's scholarship. So with no further ado, I am very pleased to introduce you to J.L. Bell, John Bell. John, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you, everybody.
It's great to have you with us, and I'm really thrilled. And before we really get into the book, I'd like to learn a little bit, have you tell our audience a little bit about your work and how you got into this. Tell us what was your path into starting up the blog and then ending up writing this book?
Okay, it's a bit of a winding road. As you just told the folks, I grew up in Middlesex County, Massachusetts, as in every Middlesex village and farm by Longfellow, during the bicentennial. And in fact, I was in 5th grade when Massachusetts curriculum says that you study the Revolution during the bicentennial. So I got this triple dose of revolutionary history, especially revolutionary history in Massachusetts. And I loved it, and I was entertained, and I was enlightened, and I had little books and souvenirs and my own replica Declaration of Independence and things like that. But I thought that those stories had all been told. I thought that there was really nothing more to learn about them, especially after David Hackett Fisher's fine 1994 book, I think, Paul Revere's Ride. And then a few years after that, when I was taking my first plane trip to London, I picked up a little book from the publishing company I was working with, a little biography of Samuel Adams, because I thought it would be cheeky to read a biography of Samuel Adams on a trip to Britain. And that told me stuff that I hadn't heard before, and stuff that I thought, always people say, oh, I never heard this in school. And often that's, well, yes, you did, you just forgot it. But I really did pay attention, I thought. So I was surprised at this story, and I started looking into it some more because I thought it actually could make an interesting children's novel. And as I was studying and digging in, finding good sources and lucking out, that I was very lucky that it happened at the time when the internet was spreading, library networks were getting really in place. So I had a lot of sources to find, that I came across this story of cannon being stolen from a Boston armory a few months before the start of the war. And I just kept following that. And eventually, I have to say, close to 15 years later, it became a book. So that was the winding road. At some point around 2005, I had a bunch of little stories that didn't fit into an article form, couldn't make a paper, but I still wanted to study, to share them with the world. And a couple of friends of mine, one of them said, you should just have a blog. And the other one said, yeah, I could build a website for you to tell these stories, but it would be using blog software. So I thought, well, why don't I just start a blog? And so that's how I launched Boston 1775 in 2006. And it was, that was when blogs were the hot thing in the internet. Now it's social media and podcasts and videocasts like this, but back then blogs ruled the earth, and it just became my habit to write something, little article about the revolution every day, and I've been doing that every day, including weekends, since 2006.
And it's absolutely remarkable. None of us understand at all how you do this or how you have a life, but we love it, and we very much appreciate all of the research that you do. So thank you for all of that. Now, before we get into the story, the road to Concord, and how stolen cannons ignited the Revolutionary War, tell us a little bit about the Massachusetts militia system. What were the rules? What was your civic duty?
The Massachusetts militia system was based on the British system. It was in place all over the empire, and it was basically that people were responsible for their own military self-defense. The same way there was no police force yet, really, or no professional firefighting, things like that. Everybody was supposed to turn out in the case of an emergency. Well, in the militia, if there was a military emergency, everybody was supposed to turn out in the case of that. And by everybody, that means all men between the ages of 16 and 60 were supposed to drill in the Massachusetts militia. The laws differed somewhat from one colony to another. In Massachusetts, there were exceptions for people at the top of society. So your ministers, your Harvard professors, people who had already, elected officials, people who had already been militia officers, they weren't required to practice. And then in the bottom of society, Blacks and Native Americans were not brought into the militia, although they were sort of expected to turn out during the actual emergency. They just weren't supposed to train. The training days were in some ways sort of civic or local celebrations. They would happen 4 times a year. The men would go out, they would learn their moves, they would practice, they would have their weapons inspected, they would make fun of their officers, they would get to see their cousins, and often there would be a feast at the end. I get the sense that during peacetime, you elected the richest guy in town to be the officer because he would give you a good feast. And during wartime, or if war was looming, then you definitely wanted some veteran of the last war who knew what he was doing to be in charge. And interestingly, in the year 1774, in that fall, there was a turnover, and the Massachusetts militia sort of reorganized itself, made sure that all the loyalists, all the people who weren't serious about this, were booted out, and a lot more veterans of the last war got officers because people were getting serious about that, and they knew that this militia might, in fact, have to go to war.
So, and we'll get to war as soon as we ignite it, but I'd like to know also, how well armed were these Massachusetts towns versus the crown troops?
Quite poorly, in a couple of ways. One is that they did not have standardized weapons the way the British Army did. The British Army would, be ordering hundreds and thousands of muskets at once, all to the same specifications, so everybody could use the same musket balls. And the militia would turn out, and there would be men with old blunderbusses or muskets from the last war, or their fowling weapons, which were lighter long guns that shot smaller pellets. So everybody needed their own size of musket balls or other missiles, other ammunition. A lot of it was standard for a British regular soldier to have a bayonet and a small sword and other weapons, and the militiamen, most of them didn't have bayonets. They were often supposed to have hatchets. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. It was just not as well equipped by any means. On the other hand, the big advantage that the New England militia had, and that Americans had through most of the wars, they didn't have the equipment, they didn't have the training, but they had the numbers. And so whereas General Gage in Boston had 5,000 well-armed, fully equipped troops, the Massachusetts militia could turn out 20,000 men overnight. And even if you don't have all the weapons, 4-to-1 advantage is a big advantage.
So tell us the difference between militia and Minutemen.
Minutemen were a subset of the militia. And in fact, there was, although there had been this tradition in New England of the idea that certain militia would be ready to march at a minute's notice, this was really codified in the fall of 1774, when the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, which was the shadow government out in the countryside, sent out to the town saying, yes, now is time to reorganize your militia, make sure that the officers are on our side. And they also recommended forming the towns form companies that would be ready to march at short notice. And these became known quickly as minute companies because they were supposed to be ready in a minute. But every town defined Minutemen differently because it was being organized at the town level. The provincial Congress didn't have the authority to say, this is how you do it. So that some towns, they would, like Braintree, the Minutemen would drill 4 hours a week, and the regular militia would be drilling 3 hours a week. In Lexington, they never formed a minute company. In Westboro, there was a minute company that was formed, and then they went to the town meeting and asked, okay, are you going to give us extra pay? And the town meeting said, no, we're not asking you to do anything more than a regular militia. We are not paying you anything to do more than a regular militia. You can call yourself Minutemen, but we're all in this together. But the idea of the Minuteman became a symbol of this readiness by the New England and especially the Massachusetts militia. And so many towns did form Minutemen companies, and they did march, but just 30 seconds behind the Minutemen came the other militia companies.
So unrest really began after the French and Indian War and grew for about 10 years in all of the colonies. What made Massachusetts such a hotbed of radicals that really escalated matters into war?
Well, that's a very deep question, I think. And I think one aspect of it is Massachusetts's old roots in Puritan settlement, that there was a strain of defying the king that goes back to the English Civil War that was still alive in Massachusetts. In the middle of Boston, there was a tavern called the Cromwell's Head with a big picture of Oliver Cromwell outside. Well, this is the only place in the British Empire where people still thought Oliver Cromwell was a good idea. If you went to London early in the 1700s, Cromwell's head was still displayed on a pike on London Bridge. In Boston, they were celebrating him. Another aspect of it in Massachusetts, or in Boston specifically, the 1700s started with Boston as the biggest, wealthiest British settlement in North America. And by the middle of the century, Philadelphia was bigger and more dynamic and growing, and New York was bigger and getting more trade. And Boston was losing some business to these other ports. And I think that there was also in the Boston's response a feeling that they were losing out, that they were stagnated. The population had not grown. And so there was a bit of resentment about that. And then just when the news of the Stamp Act arrived in 1765, there was also a wave of bankruptcies in Boston due to the failure of a particular businessman who had loaned money to a lot of other people. And so Boston was very hyped up about that. And then here comes the Crown asking for more money. There is some argument that New England overall was more egalitarian. In society, it was more prone to, it was more used to democracy. But it is interesting to note that it was really Boston that was causing all the trouble until about 1774. And then suddenly the Massachusetts countryside became the source of all the worst resistance for the Crown.
So we're starting to get more specific here, which is where I love going with this particular book. And, we could spend an entire show, even a semester-long course, in talking about what led up to the events of April 19th. And we don't have time for that. What I'm going to do, though, is I am going to say to everybody, if you go to 10crucialdays.org, this is my website here. If you go to 10crucialdays.org and you go to the About tab, and on this About tab, if you hit Downloads, and under Downloads, you'll see Timeline of the American Revolution right here, Timeline of the American Revolution. And if you hit Timeline of the American Revolution, you will get an overview very quickly that leads us all the way up through the Stamp Act that John just mentioned, the Virginia Resolves, and then as we get closer up to 1774, these red items, incidents, are actual times when there were some shooting going on. So you can see that we get up to 1774, and you'll notice this list: the Intolerable Acts, the Boston Port Act, the Administration of Justice Act, Massachusetts Government Act. These are all wonderful things that you'll be able to read, and you will learn more about these books in Mary Norton's wonderful book, Mary Beth Norton's wonderful book called 1774. But John's book is even more specific. So, John, what I would love to have you do at the beginning of the road to Concord, how four stolen cannons ignited the Revolutionary War, you have this terrific timeline of the month of September 1774. What happened in September of 1774? We know that there were, before Lexington and Concord, there were other powder alarms. Tell us about them and what made Lexington and Concord different.
Well, what happened on the first day of September 1774 is General Thomas Gage, who was the royal governor of Massachusetts, decided to take a bit more control, and he sent troops out of Boston to a neighboring town, Charlestown, to remove the gunpowder that was stored in a tower on a hill there. That gunpowder all belonged to the Massachusetts Militia. He was the commander-in-chief of the militia, so he had every legal right to take control of that powder, and he had it all brought into Boston. But the people of Massachusetts had seen those coercive acts, and especially the Massachusetts Government Act, changing their constitution unilaterally from London. And they were seeing now this attack on what they considered their self-defense system, the militia powder. So they rose up on the 2nd of September, 1774, and about 5,000 militiamen marched into Cambridge and surrounded the houses of royal officials there, demanded that they resign from the Massachusetts Council, which had been rewritten under the new Constitution, demanded that they apologize for following the Massachusetts Government Act, surrounded the lieutenant governor's house and pounded on his windows until he came out and signed a resignation and finally left and went into Boston. And by the end of the 2nd of September, 1774, it was very clear that General Gage no longer had any authority outside the gates of Boston. The rest of the province was up for grabs. B, the rural parts of Massachusetts had become more militant than Boston. You know, for the previous 9-10 years, Boston had been causing all the trouble, and the rural towns would, every so often, they would write a letter and say, yes, that is, yes, you know, whatever trade things you're having trouble with, whatever tariffs, yes, as we farm our wheat out here, that's a really bad thing. Sorry, that's happening to you. But they weren't getting militant about it. And then come September 1774, suddenly those men were marching with their guns to try to shut down the royal government. And the third thing that happened that was clear at the end of September 2nd, 1774, is that this political dispute that had been going on for a decade and had been heating up and cooling down, then heating up again, it was not going to be solved through purely political means. There was going to be a military aspect to the resolution, whether it was simply the threat of military force or actual military force. So over the next few days, suddenly General Gage starts to fortify Boston. He starts to build up the wall and the gates on the very narrow neck that leads into town, the only way into town by land. He has the Royal Navy warships come close into the town. He is basically guarding himself against the people he is supposed to govern. Meanwhile, out in the countryside, the towns start to look at what military supplies they have nearby. They start that process of upping the militia training. This eventually leads in the next month to the creation of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, that shadow government outside of Boston. Meanwhile, in Boston, there is, in the area just surrounding it, there's what I call an arms race in September 1774, where the Patriots and the British military race to grab hold and control all the artillery pieces, all the cannon and mortars that they can find. And there are a lot of them. There are cannons in all the shore batteries, all the fortifications that have been built to guard that harbor against the French and the Spanish and any other invaders by sea. Well, in Charlestown, just north of Boston, the locals come, they take all the cannon out of their shore battery and pull them into the countryside. This happens in Dorchester, south of Boston. Inside Boston, there are cannon in the the fortifications. The British military grabbed some of those. There are also 4 cannon that belong to the militia train, or the artillery company called the train. And those are stored in 2 gun houses or armories in the center of town. General Gage sees these, they're small weapons, but the militia is very proud of them. The militia unit itself has fallen apart because the commander is loyalist, but the men mostly are patriots, so they can't get along. General Gage doesn't want to lose control of these, so he set guards in front of all these, in front of these 2 armories, each of them having 2 weapons. And then in the middle of September 1774, overnight, 2 of those guns are gone. There's a hole in the side of the building. So he doubles the guard on the other armory. He sends people to take the weapons out of that building and take them into the British Army camp nearby. And when the Royal Artillery officer comes with a key to open that building, those guns are gone as well. And those are the 4 stolen cannon that I talk about in the subtitle of my book. And those are also what's out in Concord in April 1775.
Lo and behold, as you were describing that, I could hear the Mission Impossible music in my brain that was going on. So it really was this arms race. I mean, you had these other powder alarms in Salem and Portsmouth, but it was really when these guns were commandeered by these radicals, if you will, that really pushed Gage over the top. I mean, this is what he said, okay, we can't mess around now. Now we got to hang on to our guns.
It's quite clear. I mean, by the end of September 1774, he was writing home to his boss, Lord Dartmouth, the Secretary of State, and his other boss, Viscount Barrington, the Secretary of War, and saying, these people are crazy. These people are militant. You cannot underestimate this. You cannot, if you think you can put this down with 10,000 men, send 20,000, budget £1 million. And the people in London thought he was crazy. The people thought he was exaggerating, alarmist, and they gave him some more soldiers, but they were not listening to what he had to say. So he clearly knew that there was things had become much worse for him. Over the course of the fall of 1774, there were other places, Rhode Island and Connecticut, started to grab hold of their weapons as well and move them into the countryside where they could be under the control of patriots rather than vulnerable to the British military. On December 14th, 1774, New Hampshire militia actually raided the fort in Portsmouth Harbor and took away all the cannon there and took away gunpowder and cannonballs. And that was the small British force guarding that fort actually fired, the commander reported firing one of his cannon at the raiders coming at him. So that was really the first shot of the Revolutionary War. Nobody was killed, so we don't count it. But clearly there was a military action going on there.
So
then
that one wasn't heard around the world.
That wasn't heard around the world, even though it was a cannon, so it should have been louder. And then in the winter of 1775, General Gage started to get good intelligence about where the cannons stolen from Boston the previous September were, because he had a spy among the top echelon of Patriot leaders in Massachusetts. And he began to send out troops to places. Now, that initial operation on September 1st, 1774, which I talked about, that later historians called the powder alarm, because that was when he confiscated, or his soldiers confiscated mostly powder. In 75, Gage's troops were looking for cannon. They were looking for artillery pieces, and they did go to Salem in February 1775. They almost got to where, indeed, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress's agent was collecting cannon, not the cannon from Boston, but other cannon. But they were stymied and they had to go back. There were other marches out into the countryside from Boston It's unclear whether Gage was just giving the men exercise or trying to get the countryside used to seeing soldiers on the march, or actually looking for cannon. But certainly the people out in the towns feared that there were going to be more raids for artillery pieces. And then in April 1775, Gage got word from London that it was time to act. He had to do something to, no more sitting around. And he got word from spies out in Concord that, yeah, we found the cannon that you're looking for.
So it was very shortly after he received his green light, if you will, from London, that Gage decided to move. So let's, many of the folks in our audience are not in Massachusetts. We're all over the middle colonies here and throughout the country. So you have some visuals that you can show us here about what we're looking at in terms of what it looks like.
Yes, let us see. All right, sharing my screen. Here is my book and my website. I'll just linger over that fondly.
We'll be reminding people to go to boston1775.net and make sure that they sign up. You've got a lot of catching up to do if you haven't subscribed to John's blog in the past. So there we go, 13 miles.
This is the roads to Concord, as I said, and this is the map, the official map from the National Park Service, showing the move from Boston over here on the right, all the way through the countryside to Concord on the left. And we also see the routes of Paul Revere and of his fellow writer, William Dawes. Roger provided me with this bird's eye view that might make it easier to visualize. Here is the peninsula of Boston, which you can also see over here on the flat map. And the British went across the estuary of the Charles River and then more or less straight west to Concord. Dawes took this big long loop because he went out that short narrow land route. Revere went across the river and then went west. But the most important riders that day, I would suggest, are in fact the British officers who were sent out by Gage before in order to make sure that messengers like Revere and Dawes did not get through. And indeed, they did prevent Revere and Dawes from getting all the way to Concord. However, simply by sending out a dozen British officers on horseback with their weapons and capes over their uniforms, but they were still wearing their uniforms, that alerted the countryside, so that when the British column marching west got to Lexington, they ran into the mobilized local militia unit. And there was a confrontation on the green because the column did not want to walk past these armed men, and the armed men did not want to give up their arms, and it ended with fatal firing by the British. And this was the first death of the war. And that was why we consider this the beginning of the Revolutionary War. After that skirmish at Lexington, the British column continued on as fast as they could to Concord, reached the center of Concord, and then it's not just Concord that they were looking for. Here we expand. They wanted to get out of Concord, over the North Bridge, and out to Barrett's Farm. Barrett's Farm was where the Patriots were storing a lot of their weapons. Colonel James Barrett was the man in charge of that effort. So once they got to getting to Concord was like getting to the orbit around the moon, but you wanted to get to the moon's surface, and that meant going another mile or so to the North Bridge, across the North Bridge to Colonel James Barrett's farmstead. By the time they got there, however, the Barretts had been warned for quite a while, and the young men had taken the cannon that were indeed the 4 cannon from Boston, stolen the previous September, and other weapons, and they had moved them by ox cart to neighboring towns and hidden them. So the British went all that way, 17 miles to Concord, 2 more miles across the bridge over to the farm, and they were searching for things which were no longer there. Meanwhile, back at the bridge, there was another confrontation and another fatal exchange of fire. This time, both sides took casualties. There were British soldiers killed. There were American militiamen killed. Then, curiously, the Americans pulled back so that the companies at Barrett's farm were able to come back across the bridge. They weren't cut off as they could have been. And the Americans waited until the British finished searching all of Concord and then got out of the populated part of town and then had to go all the way back to Boston. And by this time, there were, as I said before, tens of thousands of militiamen marching towards what is now called the Battle Road. And although only about 3,000 or 4,000 provincials actually got close enough to fight the British, well, the British were only about less than 2,000 at this point, even of the reinforcements that came out to Boston. So they had to fight their way all the way back those 19 miles. Although it was a planned withdrawal, they weren't retreating. They weren't planning to hold Concord. It was nevertheless a clear defeat for the British military and a very inauspicious start to the war for them. And it was all because General Gage wanted to search that farm out in Concord.
A very quick aside, John, we just got a question that that has been asked for many centuries. Who fired the first shot?
Well, it was at Portsmouth, so it was,
there we go.
The first shot at Lexington, it's not clear who fired. Both sides blame the other, and it's possible that it was an accidental shot, somebody clearing his gun. It was more likely a provincial than a redcoat soldier, simply because the provincials were not as disciplined as the soldiers. But it is also quite clear that it was not a shot fired by the men on the common, the men actually facing the British soldiers. It was somebody somewhere else in the neighborhood. The person I would like to interrogate, if I could, was a man named Solomon Brown, who actually did speak about firing twice at the British soldiers during their time in Lexington. He had been among the men who had agreed, young men earlier in the evening, to go. He volunteered to ride to Concord and warn the people in Concord that these British officers were in the area. And he was stopped on the way and held at gunpoint and arrested and detained. And then the same officers captured Revere and Dawes. Captured Revere, didn't capture Dawes. And then eventually, after hours of being a captive, Solomon Brown was let go and he went back to Lexington. So for him, I bet the war had already started. I bet he felt that maybe he was firing the first shot, but it wasn't the first aggressive military action that he was involved in. He was on the other side of some harsh treatment. And so maybe that's why he felt justified in firing. That, at least, as I say, he's the one I want to interrogate.
So we have a question here from the audience. Could you comment on how the provincials might have contemplated actually using the cannon as they were stockpiling weapons? Did they have a certain design in mind in terms of using the cannon in particular?
That is a very good question, because I have looked and I have not seen any of the cannon they had collected, and they had collected over 3 dozen by their own accounts, any deployed during the actual Battle of Lexington and Concord. It may be that they were not equipped well enough, they were not on carriages and they couldn't move them into the action well enough or quickly enough. It may be that they didn't have enough of the powder and the shot and stuff like that. They did very quickly, of course, at the end of the day and over the next couple of days, move those cannon around Boston. And so they ended up being siege guns. They ended up being guns that were used to try to keep the British inside Boston instead of coming out and raiding, and to then eventually, when they got more weapons from the Lake Champlain area under Colonel Henry Knox, to actually drive the British out of Boston by threatening their positions and their shipping. The Provincials did deploy 4 companies of artillery in the Battle of Bunker Hill, and it went very badly. And so they did know how to use these weapons from the previous wars, from their service at sea, but it's not really clear what strategic value these weapons had, aside from being that's what an 18th century army needed.
Right, exactly. Before we go any further, I want to correct myself. I did my math a little askew. Earlier, I said 246 years. It was 247 years today. So I just wanted to make that correction. We have another question from the audience. Is there any definitive list of Minutemen names as opposed to just regular militiamen? Do we know who was a Minuteman as opposed to who was just in the militia?
Sometimes towns would say that. There are the best sources for who served on April 19th, 1775 are the pay records that the towns, as good thrifty Yankees, sent into the Massachusetts government asking for their men to be paid. And of course, each of these needs to have the name of the man who served and how many days he served. And those, the ones that survive have all been compiled. They're often published in local histories. There was a book by Frank Warren Coburn called The Battle of April 19th, 1775. It is available on the web because it's old enough that it's in the public domain. And the version of that book on Happy Trust includes the appendix, which includes the surviving muster rolls for all the companies he believed actually got into the battle and a few more. And so those will say who all the individual militia and Minutemen are, and you can look at them and see whether the companies are designated as Minutemen or as ordinary militia.
So another question from the audience: why did it spread from Boston to the other outer lying areas?
The militancy, I think the big the Stamp Act back in 1765 covered everybody, and that's why it caused such a tremendous resistance from everybody. The tariffs of 1768, after the Stamp Act was repealed, that really only affected the import merchants, and therefore they had a much harder time, the merchants inside Boston, inside New York, Philadelphia, the other ports, getting the rural farmers to care. Like, oh, poor babies, you can't get luxury paints. That's it. Now, of course, tea, which was the most lucrative of those commodities that was being taxed. Well, once you tax a society's source of caffeine, that becomes personal to everybody. So in fact, there was a certain amount of resentment about tea, but what really caught the Massachusetts countryside in the summer of 1774 was the Massachusetts Government Act. This was a top-down rewriting of the Constitution, which said, basically, it said, for instance, that the upper house of the legislature would no longer be elected, but be totally appointed from London. And probably most important, it said that the towns could no longer have more than one town meeting a year without the express approval of the royal governor. And that was a big change for a society which had been used to governing themselves in their town meetings for 150 years. And that, I think, was what really caused the uprising. And in fact, it took less than 3 weeks from when that law started to be implemented by General Gage to the powder alarm of September 2nd, 1774, when 5,000 men were marching with their guns towards Boston.
So one of our audience members has asked a question, which I'll have to preface by saying, as a former bookseller and a publisher now, I would say to the audience, you should go out and get both books. But he asks the question, what makes Road to Concord different from the Hackett Fisher's book, Paul Revere's Ride?
And I'm very fond of David Hackett Fisher's book. he doesn't have anything about Bates Cannon. He did not get that story. He has a lot of stories in there. Some of them are not, I think, yeah, I would say he collected a lot of local lore that had not been published for a long time. And 80% of it is fascinating and 20% of it is bunk. And I'm glad that it's there. I'm glad that it can be looked at. He has some, he posited that Dr. Joseph Warren had General Gage's wife as a crucial intelligence source. And I argue on the blog mostly that that's just not, that doesn't hold up. So there are other things in which I disagree with him about, but it is nevertheless a very good book, especially on the historiography. In fact, the last chapter of The Road to Concord is a chapter on how the story of the stolen cannon was told, retold, exaggerated, then debunked and totally lost for a century and brought back by me. And I really modeled that after Fisher's appendix on historiography, which when I read it really sort of opened my eyes to what how this way we tell our histories changed itself, how there's a history of history telling.
John and I would agree. John is an expert on the whole revolution, and in particular the revolution in Massachusetts. I am somewhat of a scholar of the revolution in New Jersey and the 10 Crucial Days, and of course, Hackett Fisher's book on Washington Crossing does this very same thing. There are some myth in there that is covered, but John and I, am sure, would agree that we applaud Professor Hackett Fisher for what he has done to bring the historiography of the revolution to readers all around. And in fact, yesterday, the Massachusetts Society of the Sons of the American Revolution presented David Hackett Fisher with a Distinguished Patriot Award at the Colonial Inn in Concord for his body of work, because he is somebody who we all read, and we certainly encourage you to read. So, John, there were the two of the stolen cannon were in Concord. Where were the others?
Oh, all four were in Concord
okay.
by April 1775, along with some other weapons. Concord itself had some guns that the town owned, and then there were Colonel Barrett's weapons out at his farm, which he then was moving on. There were other cannon in Worcester, which is another rural county seat. And those were the two main areas of keeping these armaments available. We can see from the Massachusetts Provincial Congress's Committee of Safety records that they were starting to organize militia or artillery companies to train on these guns and to use these guns. So they were being spread out to even more towns at that time. The four, I suspect they were moved to another town called Stowe, which is even smaller than Lexington, and is a good place to hide something, because that was where the Massachusetts Provincial Congress's the equivalent of the treasurer was. So he was already a person of authority, and there were cannons hidden there reportedly. Unfortunately, I don't know what happened to the cannon after May 1775. They drop out of the record, and I'm still looking until they come back, sent home. Two of them survived the war and are sent home to Massachusetts by Secretary of War Henry Knox to Governor John Hancock.
So we have an audience member who has asked a terrific question. The answer is they did, but I want to hear what John says. The question is, do you think Gage, Lord North, or George III could have done anything after Lexington and Concord to appease the colonists to avert independence?
Yes, I think that the bulk of the American colonists, and even probably the bulk of New England colonists, in the summer of 1775 were still feeling themselves to be loyal to the British Constitution as they understood it. And that meant that they felt that they should be, taxation without representation is not allowed, that they should be able to choose their own legislature, and the legislature would choose taxation and set other policy. And if the government in London had been able to stomach that, then it might very well have been able to come up with a peace. However, that would have meant completely rewriting the British Constitution, because the British Constitution, they had just spent the 1600s and early 1700s arguing, warring, having a civil war about who was in charge. And came out at the end with the idea that the Parliament was the sovereign, the Parliament was the supreme power, the king was the embodiment of the parliamentary power. The king had to be Protestant. That was very important in that century. And therefore, they could not have worked a system in which Parliament was equal to, the New Hampshire legislature, which is what the Americans were sort of asking. If we don't have representation in Parliament, but we do have representation in our own legislature, then all the legislatures should be about the same. And that just would not have worked under the British Constitution.
So I want to look at the larger picture, bring us into the 21st century here. Why is this relevant? Why is it relevant for us to understand and learn about the American Revolution?
Well, I think every society has an origin story and reveres its origin story and believes that it's very important. I mean, this is something that unites a society, is thinking that its origin is significant and that is somehow different, special, possibly slightly superior to other societies, or at least unique. And so I think since we're going to be revering that story anyway, we might as well get it right. We might as well know what actually happened. We might as well get all the lessons we can out of it.
So you almost answered my next question. The January 6th insurrectionists commandeered symbols of the American Revolution to justify their actions at the Capitol. Other living historians and hereditary organization members don 18th century dress. They carry some of the very same flags and banners that were carried on the Capitol steps. What can American Revolutionary public historians, historic site interpreters, and hereditary organization color guard members do to inform the public about our real history?
I think, those groups, those people, that's what they're already doing. That's their job. And asking them to do their job better, I'm sure they're already trying, or we're already trying. I think that one question I would like people to think about is, what exactly is special about the American origin? And it's not that people were brave, because people were brave, but people were brave in other societies as well, and for other causes, some of which we would think are anathema. It was I like Abraham Lincoln's formulation in the Gettysburg Address of what sets the American government apart, that it was dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. A proposition is something that one has to prove all the time. And it's not that, because we had this fine battle back in April 19th, 1775, that proves the American system works. What's going to prove the American system works is that tomorrow we are still acting on that proposition and putting it to the proof and making it work. And so if we can see not just the tradition and the past, but a long string of these ideals put into place, not always perfectly, not always well, sometimes backsliding, sometimes having to learn new, that I think is the lesson we can take from our past, from our origin, and for the future.
So what were some of the common misconceptions about the battles of Lexington and Concord?
There are a lot. So let's see. Some of the things I've been talking about just this past week, the British were not looking for John Hancock and Samuel Adams in Lexington. The British came to a fork in the road. The road off to Concord went in one direction. The road to where Hancock and Adams had been staying was in another direction. They went off to Concord. They didn't go anywhere near where Hancock and Adams had been. The Patriots were worried about being arrested, but they weren't arrested. That was not part of the orders. But for over 200 years, American historians were saying, well, the British were looking for Hancock and Adams. Another common myth, especially since Longfellow, is that those two signals from the Old North Church, the two lanterns showing that the British would be crossing the river and then marching in west, which was a way of knowing where their destination was probably going to be conquered, that had any effect on what happened, because those signals went out from the church. They went across the river to Charlestown. Charlestown put a man on a horse. He rode off, and he has never been heard from again. Nobody got the message. And it took Paul Revere, who already knew where the British were going. He had sent the signals to go across the river, get off his boat, get on another horse, ride west, avoid being captured by probably the same officers who stopped the first guy, and then get around those officers by going through Medford and go west. That was what got the message through to Hancock and Adams and others in Lexington. So the signals, beautiful, poetic. You can just see the image. I've seen the lanterns shining from the Old North steeple at night. They're just gorgeous, and it meant nothing. And then it is quite common for people who are very enamored of gun rights to say that the British were coming to confiscate the people's guns. And yes and no, they were not coming to confiscate people's individually owned muskets and pistols. There was nothing of that. They were coming to look for those cannon, the cannon that were collectively owned, the cannon that had no other purpose but military use. You don't hunt with cannon. There was a search for what in this millennia we call weapons of mass destruction. They were searching for military weapons from a rebellion that had basically taken the countryside out of British rule for several months. We can argue about, okay, maybe that's also included in the Second Amendment, or since the private ownership of cannon was allowed, these were privately owned guns in a way, or things like that. But we have to realize that the British was not coming to take people's muskets. They were looking at military weapons and a rebellious government. So those are three misconceptions that are common in how we tell the story of the beginning of the revolution.
Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us in the road. Listen to John Bell in his book, The Road to Concord. I encourage you all to purchase a copy wherever books are sold. If you go to History Author Talks, you'll see right up top here, I've got bookshop.org, and you'll be able to scroll down and see many different books on the American Revolution, on the past, let's see here. If you go, whoops, that's not what I wanted. If you go to the past programs tab, you will be able to find, here's the past programs tab, you will be able to find the link to purchase John's books. And I also urge you to sign up for our program next week, The Remarkable Cause, Jean O'Connor, novel about James Lovell and the Crucible of Revolution. Then we also have Mark Edward Lender coming up on May 3rd. And if you go to History Author Talks, you'll see our other programs that are going to be coming up, including the aforementioned David Hackett Fisher with his new book. So with that, I wanted to thank you all for joining us this evening. If you want, you can go to 10crucialdays.org. It's always great for the donations that it helps me with historic education. And John, I thank you for your time, and I thank you all for joining us this evening on History Author Talks. Thank you very much. Good night, everyone.
Thanks, folks.
Take care.